The day began like any other for Daniel Ross, a quiet single father who worked as a janitor at the Naval Command facility on the outskirts of Virginia Beach. His uniform was plain, faded blue, and his mop bucket squeaked softly down the long, polished corridors that smelled faintly of wax and sea salt. No one really looked at him. To most, he was just another man sweeping up after heroes. But what they didn't know, what he'd buried deep beneath years of silence, was that Daniel Ross once wore the trident himself. Once, the men in those framed photos along the wall had saluted him. Once, they'd whispered his name in missions classified far beyond top secret. Back then, they called him Lone Eagle, a ghost in the field, a sniper whose shot never missed, a legend who disappeared after the war that broke him. Now, he was just Mr. Ross, the janitor, the guy who cleaned up after the Admiral's coffee spills and took extra shifts because his little boy, Jake, needed braces and school books. That morning, Daniel had arrived early, as always, pushing his cart down the hall outside the strategy briefing room where the SEAL Admiral, Thomas Harlan, was holding an orientation for new recruits. Laughter spilled through the door, the kind of easy arrogance only the young and untested carried. "You there, old-timer," one of the recruits called out, spotting Daniel through the open doorway. "Hey, what's your call sign, janitor?" The room erupted with laughter. Daniel just smiled faintly, adjusting his gloves, his gray eyes calm but unreadable. He'd heard worse. Before he could answer, Admiral Harlan turned toward the door, his chest full of ribbons, his tone carrying the lazy amusement of authority. "A call sign?" "That's right," he said with a grin. "Every man in this building ought to have one. Even the janitor." The room laughed harder. Daniel looked up slowly. His voice was steady, quiet, but there was something in it, something that froze the air. "Lone Eagle," he said. The laughter stopped instantly. The Admiral blinked, the color draining from his face as if he'd seen a ghost. The recruits shifted awkwardly, confused by the sudden tension. Harlan's mouth opened slightly, his eyes scanning Daniel's features as if trying to remember a face from a nightmare. "Say that again," he whispered. Daniel tilted his head. "You asked for my call sign, sir." He paused. "It's Lone Eagle." The Admiral stepped closer, his boots echoing across the polished floor. "You served?" he asked quietly. "Once," Daniel replied. "A long time ago." The silence was heavy now, thick with the weight of memory. Admiral Harlan's gaze softened, recognition dawning in his eyes. He remembered that name from the mission reports, from the whispered tales of a man who went missing after Operation Iron Dagger, a mission no one survived. No one except him. Daniel simply nodded once and returned to his mopping, the movement calm and practiced, as if the world hadn't just tilted on its axis. The recruits stared in stunned silence, their earlier laughter now replaced by the uneasy respect of men who suddenly realized they'd mocked a ghost from their own legend. When Daniel finished the hallway, he gathered his tools and slipped out into the cold morning air. The sun was just climbing over the water, painting the base in gold. He took out his phone, cracked an old, and saw a message from Jake's school: "Career day tomorrow. Parents welcome to share what they do." Daniel smiled faintly, sighing. What could he tell his son? That he mopped floors where he once commanded men? That heroes fade into maintenance shifts and broken dreams? He texted back, "I'll be there." Later that afternoon, Admiral Harlan found himself still thinking about the janitor. He couldn't shake it, the calm in that man's eyes, the precision of his tone. It was the same quiet confidence he'd seen in men who'd walked through fire and returned with ghosts in their eyes. He pulled up an old classified file, fingers trembling slightly. The name Lone Eagle blinked on the screen beside the words "Presumed Kia, 2012. A photo loaded slowly, grainy, black and white, of a younger Daniel Ross in combat gear, rifle across his chest, expression hard as stone. The Admiral leaned back in his chair, stunned. "What the hell are you doing here, son?" he muttered. Meanwhile, Daniel finished his shift, clocked out, and drove home to the small, worn-down apartment where Jake was waiting with a science project on the table. "Hey, Dad," Jake grinned. "They said parents can talk about their jobs tomorrow. You gonna tell them about the base?" Daniel smiled, sitting beside him. "Yeah," he said softly. "Something like that." He helped Jake glue tiny stars to a cardboard sky, his hand steady despite the tremor of old memories that sometimes returned at night, the sound of helicopters, the scream of rockets, the faces of the brothers he'd lost. When Jake fell asleep, Daniel sat by the window with an old, battered coin in his hand, the SEAL Challenge coin he'd kept hidden all these years. He turned it over, staring at the engraved words, honor, courage, commitment. He whispered to himself, some things you never stop being. The next morning, word had spread around the base. The janitor wasn't just a janitor, he was that lone eagle. The Admiral called a private meeting, wanting to confirm the truth, but Daniel never showed up. Instead, he was in Jake's classroom, standing quietly as his son introduced him to a room full of kids. "This is my dad," Jake said proudly. "He keeps the Navy base clean so people can work safely." The other kids clapped, and Daniel smiled, feeling something he hadn't in years, peace. He didn't notice Admiral Harlan had entered the doorway, watching silently. When the class ended, Harlan approached him. "You didn't tell anyone?" Daniel shook his head. "Not my story anymore, sir." The Admiral nodded slowly. "Maybe it should be. The Navy could use men like you again." Daniel looked at him for a long moment, then down at Jake. "I already serve where I'm needed." For a moment, Harlan almost smiled. "Still the same lone eagle," he murmured. As Daniel walked away, hand in hand with his son, the Admiral called after him quietly, "The world could use more men like you, Ross." Daniel didn't turn back. "The world already has them," he said softly. "They just don't wear uniforms anymore." The Admiral watched him disappear into the sunlight, humbled and silent. Later that day, the recruits whispered about the story, about how the toughest admiral on base had been frozen by a janitor's name. They didn't laugh anymore. They stood a little straighter when they saw Daniel pushing his cart down the hall, eyes down, heart steady. Because now they knew, heroes don't always wear medals. Sometimes, they carry mops instead of rifles, scars instead of stripes, and still stand taller than anyone else in the room. That night, long after Jake had gone to sleep, Daniel Ross sat alone at his kitchen table, the hum of the old refrigerator filling the silence. On the table lay the SEAL coin, the one he had sworn he'd never touch again, beside an unopened letter marked, Department of Defense, Urgent. He'd received it weeks ago but couldn't bring himself to open it. The life he'd built now, simple, quiet, and honest, was fragile, like glass. The janitor's broom and the soldier's rifle didn't belong in the same world. But as the moonlight touched the envelope, his fingers trembled. He broke the seal. The letter inside was brief: "Former Chief Petty Officer Daniel Ross, your presence is requested at Naval Command, 0600 hours. Matter of national security." It was signed by Admiral Thomas Harlan. Daniel closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. He'd hoped this day would never come. But deep down, he knew it was inevitable. Some ghosts never stay buried. The next morning, Jake woke to find his father already dressed, wearing the same plain uniform, but there was something different in his posture, the quiet steel of purpose. "You going early, Dad?" Jake asked sleepily. Daniel smiled and ruffled his hair. "Just have to talk to someone. I'll be back before dinner." "Promise?" "Promise." Daniel walked out into the dawn, the sky painted in bruised blues and pinks. The drive to the base felt longer than usual. When he arrived, 2 guards saluted him, they actually saluted him, before escorting him to a secured briefing room. Inside, Admiral Harlan stood waiting, alongside 2 younger officers and a digital map flickering with red markers. Harlan gestured for him to sit. "I didn't mean to pull you back in, son," the Admiral began, his voice low, almost apologetic. "But we've got a situation." He tapped the screen. "A covert cell in Eastern Europe, remnants of a rogue militia we encountered during Operation Iron Dagger, resurfaced last week. They're using tactics that only one man alive would recognize, you." Daniel said nothing, his eyes fixed on the map. He remembered those coordinates. He remembered the snow, the gunfire, the men he'd lost. "Sir," he said quietly, "I'm not that man anymore." Harlan's gaze hardened. "You were the only survivor of that op, Ross. You know what happened in that bunker. We need you to confirm who's behind this before more men die." The room fell silent. Finally, Daniel leaned back, his expression unreadable. "I'll look," he said simply, "but I won't fight." Over the next few days, Daniel reviewed satellite images and intercepted footage. The memories clawed their way back, every face, every scream, every choice. Then, on the 3rd night, he saw something that made his blood run cold. In the grainy feed, a man stood before a camera. Masked but speaking in a familiar voice, calm, deliberate, chilling. "You left me to die, Eagle," the voice said. "Now I'm coming home." Daniel froze. He knew that voice. It belonged to Marcus Kane, his former spotter, the man he'd watched get hit and buried beneath rubble during Iron Dagger. The man he'd mourned. The man who should have been dead. "He lived," Daniel whispered. "He lived, and he thinks I abandoned him." Harlan's eyes widened. "You're telling me Kane's alive?" Daniel nodded slowly. "And he's not just alive, sir. He's angry." What followed was a blur of urgency, mission planning, intelligence calls, tactical briefings. The Admiral asked Daniel to consult, to help track Kane before he could strike U.S. soil. But Daniel kept one condition clear: he wouldn't pick up a weapon. Still, his instincts guided them, every pattern Kane left behind, every coded message, until one clue hit too close to home. A cargo shipment route, headed straight for Norfolk, where Daniel and Jake lived. The realization hit him like a gunshot. This wasn't just about revenge. Kane wanted him to watch everything he loved burn. That night, as storm clouds rolled in, Daniel picked up Jake from school early. "We're going to stay with a friend for a bit," he said calmly. Jake frowned. "Is something wrong, Dad?" "Just an old friend who forgot who he is." He didn't want to scare him. As they packed, Daniel's phone buzzed.